Day 1003 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So just before we head into another Change of Pace Friday video, we'll firstly take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 728,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,050 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 1 tank, 13 APVs, 5 artillery, 1 MLRS, and 1 air defense system. But the real outstanding figure here today is the Russian currency, valued at over 103 rubles per US dollar today, which are levels that are not seen since the onset of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, where the ruble briefly dipped quite low in value. But of course, Russia had a lot more options at its disposal back then to stabilize their currency, whereas these days, well, take the Russian central bank for instance, that is now admitting it's almost exhausted all of its options for holding on to any form of economic stability. But what does all of this mean? Well, a devaluing of the currency means a weaker ruble, leading to all sorts of events, including being more expensive to import raw materials or consumer goods globally. It doesn't matter if their biggest trading partner is China, as the global market is too interconnected, plus the fact that the ruble is also devaluing in lockstep with the Chinese yuan anyway. So as prices rise, real wages effectively decrease, even if nominal wages remain the same within Russia. So less bang for your buck, or in this case, less bang for your ruble, as this reduces the average consumer's ability to afford goods and services. The devalued ruble also means erosion in the value of all private Russian citizens' savings. There is also a higher cost for businesses that rely on imported equipment, materials, and technology, which in turn gets those costs passed on to the Russian consumer. Also seen is an increased debt burden for entities with foreign-denominated debt. This increases financial strain on businesses and the government. Then added to that is a reduction in government spending power, think the Russian defense budget. Also then seen is further capital flight, sending money abroad in a foreign-denominated currency, which increases selling pressure on the ruble even more. So then, with a flurry of events like all of these steamrolling into public discontent, followed by upcoming events such as civilian savings being stolen by the government, then onto austerity measures, then hyperinflation, ultimately followed by the destruction of the economy, the toppling of an empire, a so-called empire, followed by all of the Russians in New Russia trading in physical US dollars or euros for exchange of goods and services for a brief time. That is until such time the country, or whatever next constitutes the new country, restructures their debt, their currency, their additional war reparations debt, and the restructuring of their constitution that had been brutally modified by Putin that allowed him to have a constitutionally accepted, unending reign of presidentator for life. Now, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, but essentially this doesn't bode well for the Kremlin, as a weaker ruble not only amplifies economic strain on businesses and households, but also undermines public confidence in the government's ability to manage the economy, fueling unrest, thus ultimately eroding the Kremlin regime's grip on power. Then as for a quick weekly look at the territory of control, latest stats, focusing on the total Russian-occupied territory of Ukraine, including Crimea and the Donbass, where it stands at 18.41%, amounting to about an additional 0.01% of land occupied since last week. And happening right at the time when Russia has been pulling out all the stops, militarily speaking, and potentially being more actively engaged than at any other time throughout this entire war. Context. It's a clarity tool. Then headed to the map, started out in Russia, as a fierce fire rages, intersecting between Krasnodar and Adygaya, which is a federal subject of Russia's, completely surrounded by Krasnodar Krai, where flames engulfed the city's outskirts, with reports confirming a Ukrainian strike, with at least one site heavily burning. Local channels also reported that something is burning near the Yablanovsky Bridge, which actually connects these two regions. Now, questions might pop up regarding the usage of storm shadows or attackums for a location like this, but that's not really the case, as it is out of range for the most part and is an area that's well accustomed to Ukrainian UAV attacks instead. Little else is known on the target of likely a military nature as current. Then momentarily on the map, moving to Engels in the Russian Saratov Oblast, where once again we see systemic Russian corruption that has led to unmaintained Soviet infrastructure devoid of upgrades that's caused residents to grapple with an overwhelming sewerage crisis as fecal waste floods their streets and neighborhoods. So at least indirectly, we find here that Captain Putin strikes again, turning a blind eye to all of that regional corruption. Then headed into Ukraine with updates related to yesterday leading into today, where a further missile strike was said to occur at Dnipro, the city inside of the Ukrainian Oblast of Dnipropetrovsk, and looks to be in follow-up to yesterday's event of the claimed usage of a Russian intercontinental ballistic missile firing onto the Ukrainian city. Although, to get some clarity here, Russian President Vladimir Putin has since made a statement on the testing and usage of supposedly new types of intermediate range ballistic missiles, or IRBMs, known as the Oreshnik, which is said to be based on the RS-26 Rubez intercontinental ballistic missile. Although, interestingly, some parts of the wreckage were reportedly discovered to be used on other Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, such as the S-30 Bulava SLBM. Specifically, this is a submarine-launched ballistic missile with an intercontinental range. And so this was able to be noted because of the serial numbers and model codes cross-referenced to old Russian government procurement site data. Putin also stated that the usage of their IRBMs or ICBMs was in response to Ukraine's usage of long-range missiles on Russian territory. And I have to say, no clue as to what Putin refers to here, as ATACMS and Storm Shadow ranges are generally around the 250 or 300 kilometer mark, which actually falls well within the short-range category of up to 1,000 kilometers. After that, and do note, there is some optionable variation to this graph depending on the missile type and ranges expressed. So after that, then there's the medium range at 1,000 to 3,000 kilometers, then the intermediate range, different to medium range, at 3,000 to 5,500 kilometers, then there's the intercontinental range at 5,500 kilometers and beyond. So this is in fact why I always refer to Ukraine's drones that strike Moscow or St. Petersburg or even further beyond as longer ranged drones, specifically not calling them long range drones. But also note the need to recognize that the word long is not actually officially recognized as part of the military vernacular, and is instead sometimes used to informally refer to either the intermediate range or intercontinental ballistic missiles. So that's why I said it's confusing to understand what Putin is talking about here. Surprise, surprise, except if we understand it in the light of being some narrative-driven propaganda piece. But intriguingly, Putin's saying Ukraine is using long-range missiles on Russia and that Russia is using intermediate-range missiles on Ukraine is, ironically, more the distinctly opposite situation playing out closer to reality, as Russia is using quote-unquote long-range missiles against Ukraine, where intermediate falls into, and Ukraine is using short-range missiles against Russia. In fact, there is even a close-range category that is 300 kilometers or less that might even better describe what Ukraine is using when it comes to Storm Shadows and ATACMS missiles. So, to sum that one up, as you see, Spin Dr. Putin is at it again. Now, as a result of all of these events, President Zelensky condemned yesterday's missile launch as evidence that Russia is using Ukraine as a testing ground for its weaponry, and to say that ballistic missile events like these against Ukraine is yet another proof that Russia definitely does not want peace, and that it's all about total capitulation of Ukraine. But back to the missiles used. Now, most analysts suspect that Russia likely possesses only a handful of these missile types, with the total conventional warhead payload size equal to that of maybe 4 or 6 Russian air-launched cruise missiles, or a payload size of about 3 Storm Shadow cruise missiles, meaning that it closely resembles an unsustainable scare tactic that is inherently inaccurate, as it lacks the further precision found in the above-mentioned cruise missile types. And so this is where the red lines come back into the conversation, because had there hypothetically been nuclear warheads on this so-called IRBM or ICBM, which would be about a 500 kiloton charge on a 1200 kilogram payload, so to do that would be game over for Russia, and they know that. Oh, and given all of these figures I just mentioned, it's perfect timing to load up the Nuclear Strike Sim function on this map. So we'll pop in about 500 kilotons as mentioned there. We'll go to Dnipro and we'll see what it looks like. So that's just the marker, don't worry about that size there. We need to zoom in to see what it looks like. Okay, so zoom in out, all the way to Ukraine and beyond, and then zoom in back in, where we could see a fireball radius. Oh, it's on the left at 0.84 kilometers. Then a moderate blast radius of 5.6 kilometers, and then a thermal radiation limit, like that of the third degree burn, so 8.99 kilometers. So as for a hypothetical event like this, Russia already knows it can't pull off such a nuclear strike successfully from any sort of geopolitical standpoint. Even their so-called no-limits friendship, trade and security partner of China said very clearly in the past that this conflict cannot go nuclear. But then, add to that, there's already been reports of a failed nuclear-capable missile launch of an ICBM type in the past 24 hours, failing in its launch from Astrakhan in Russia's southwest, technically near the Caspian Sea. And as the old saying goes, 60% of the time, it works. Every time. Meaning, once again, that this represents a significant risk to launch these missile types anywhere, especially with a nuclear payload. Then headed around the map with a bit of a change of events, change of pace Friday, like I say there. So briefly today, somewhere in the east, in the Pokrovsk direction, a Russian BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle ceases to exist after a hit from Ukrainian forces. Then after that, somewhere in the east, specialized Ukrainian drone unit known as Rarog reports the ongoing destruction of Russian tanks, BMPs, and MTLBs, the armored personnel carriers. Then we'll head across to some news and to one of my favorite segments, Russian hardware updates, as most recently, amongst the artillery-scorched frontline fields of Ukraine, Putin's elite evidently abandoned motorcycles for small Lada civilian cars as it relates to one of their latest assaults, signaling a well-planned shift in Russian strategy. The change, however, proved disastrous as their efforts faltered. This latest example did not end well. No different to all of the rest of those Lada car assaults examples. Then for some more Russian hardware news, because in another striking development, the Russians demonstrate a clever application of Contact One ERA bricks technology on non-armored vehicles, showcasing once more their tactical ingenuity. Now, we've seen this demonstration by Russia before, and I've spoken already at some length about it, about the lack of any sort of effectiveness of this setup. But for now, summarizing to say, the loss of basic knowledge in Russia's army is stunning. Reactive armor is an explosive brick that requires a minimum backing of steel armor, usually 35mm, in order to function properly. A single bullet could theoretically take out that entire truck if those bricks are working. Alright, carry on. Then moving across to a bit of an oddity to round things off today with, guys, because during Putin's most recent televised address on escalation, in this striking 8-minute rant, Putin's typically restless hands remain eerily still in this case, appearing almost disconnected from his body. Also noting that when the video is sped up, just like this, the dissonance between his speech and hand movement becomes even more pronounced. So throughout the almost 10-minute rant, his normally fidgety hands don't even move a fraction of an inch. It's almost like a Muppet with someone else's arms. It's also been said that Putin hasn't been seen in public since the beginning of November. If that somehow conspiratorially fits into the very strange situation we see here. And parts of his body look like a still image too. You've probably heard of face swap. Maybe this is body swap. But hey, you guys tell me what you think in the comments below about what on earth is going on here. He's on something, yeah? Yeah, he's on something. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for all of the support as well. I really do notice it. Can't thank you guys enough to keep the channel going. And I really do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.